For the first time in history, Russia will host the summit of the Group of 8 industrialized nations next month. President Bush is scheduled to attend. His visit will once again raise questions about the state of U.S.-Russian relations. In recent months, the relationship has been strained by Washington's insistence that Russia was backsliding on democracy and using oil and gas supplies against its neighbors. On the other hand, Russia has demanded that it be treated with equality and respect from the United States. Joining me now is Stephen Cohen, professor of Russian Studies and History at New York University. He is also a professor emeritus of politics at Princeton. His article, The New American Cold War, appears on the cover of this week's Nation magazine. I am pleased to have him at this table. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to see you.
It really is an important piece, I must tell
you.
We'll
see.
Important pieces that make us think about where we are and where we're going. And by that definition, it does it. I read you the first two sentences. Contrary to established opinion, the gravest threat to America's national security are still in Russia. There is terrorism, there is the rise of China, all of that. You say it's still in Russia. They derive from an unprecedented development that most U.S. policymakers have recklessly disregarded, as evidenced by the undeclared Cold War Washington has waged upon both parties against post-communist Russia during the past 15 years. What's the argument you're making here?
Well, there's a series of arguments. The first is taking into consideration how important the Iraq War is. One can hope that that war will eventually end or fade away, but the problems represented by Russia, the largest territorial country in the world still, with every nasty weapon of mass destruction that we have, a country located between two civilizations, Western civilization and Islamic civilization, and a country, I argue, is still not stable, is an unprecedented situation. When the two countries were superpowers in the Cold War and they built all these weapons of mass destruction, no one ever imagined that one might collapse. And yet 15 years ago, the Russian state collapsed. An American policy, in my judgment, toward Russia should be Hippocratic. Do no harm. Do nothing to undermine the stability of Russia. Do nothing to drive Russia away from the West. Do nothing to make Russia rely more rather than less on its weapons of mass destruction and its fragile mechanisms of control. And my view is, excuse me, that since 1991, both administrations, Democratic and Republican...
That's almost at the beginning of...
From the beginning.
End of the Cold War, when the wall came down.
Well, my argument is the Cold War didn't end. I mean, that's the underbelly of my argument. That since the Clinton administration and through the Bush administration, the United States has pursued, behind some decorative notion of friendship and strategic partnership, essentially an extremely anti-Russian policy, even more anti-Russian than was our policy toward Soviet communist Russia. And like this policy or not, the result is to make our national security worse because it's exacerbating all those dangers I just mentioned to you. That's the gravamen of my argument. I want to see a completely new policy.
Your argument is that the United States, if there is a bad relationship today between Russia and the United States is at fault?
Primarily, yes. And that's hard for an American to say. It's not an easy argument to make in this country, particularly toward Russia, where we've grown up, all of us, believing that in any dispute with Russia, we were on the side of the angels. We were virtuous. For the last 15 years, we've made a grievous mistake, primarily by treating Russia as a defeated nation, analogous to the way we treated Germany and Japan after World War II, except we gave them a lot of money, and we haven't given Russia any money. Russia believes, and I believe correctly, that it did not lose the Cold War, that it was through a series of negotiations with Reagan and Bush. And you and I witnessed this, we remembered, and you had people who participated in bringing about the end of the Cold War right here. I think you even had Gorbachev at one time. But you know how that came about. It was a process of negotiation. But soon as it was over, we said, we won, you lost. And this triumphalism of American foreign policy set in, particularly toward Russia, and that's been the basis of treating Russia the way we have, which, to conclude, has had two prongs. One, trying to tell Russia what to do at home. We will tell you how to organize your political and economic life, and if you don't, we will deplore it publicly and not be your friend. And secondly, the argument that essentially Russia doesn't have or shouldn't have independent national security concerns abroad, only those of the United States. That's been the policy.
You can win a war and then discuss with a nation that has lost the Cold War the way the world ought to be from there. I mean, you know, clearly, the West won the Cold War. It seems to me.
Yeah, I understand. And I think most Americans
because if
agree.
the Soviet Empire shrank,
Yeah.
did it not?
Yeah.
The bridge came down.
Yeah.
And it did because of the power of the American economy and because Gorbachev realized they couldn't compete.
Well, that's certainly a prevailing explanation. I don't accept it, but it doesn't matter for our argument. I'm writing a book about why the Soviet Union ended, and I will submit to you that no Gorbachev, no end to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union would be there today, and possibly so would be the Cold War.
But what Gorbachev did is recognize the reality.
Yeah, and he also wanted a better country. He wanted a country he could be proud of. He thought he wasn't proud of the Soviet Union. He wanted a socialism he thought worthy of the name. He didn't exist. It's a long and complicated argument, and certainly your position is as arguable as mine. I don't say you're wrong. I don't say I'm right, but it's a complicated. But here's the point. The Russians don't agree with you. And that is a fundamental thing to understand if we want and need a good relationship with them. In other words, what we have here, this is really interesting. We have two completely different and conflicting narratives about what's happened since 1991. One American and one Russian. And to strip this down, it's the conflict of these two storytelling events, the way Russians tell the story and the way we tell the story, that's brought us to this bad relationship today. The example that your viewers will immediately recognize is that Yeltsin, who was the president of Russia throughout the 1990s, has a positive reputation in the United States on balance. In Russia, he's a despised figure.
Do we resent Putin, or did George Bush not invite Putin to Crawford and say to him, you know, here's a man I can trust and deal with?
He did. He did. He looked in his soul.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did. Ask Bush what he saw when he looked in his soul. Putin doesn't feel personally that he betrayed anybody.
In fact, Putin just said after the Kissinger interview, I don't take this dismal view of U.S.-Soviet or U.S.-Russian relations.
And nor did Kissinger, whom you had on this show, what, a week ago?
Yeah.
Nor did he take the prevailing view.
That was after meeting with Putin.
Yeah.
At Putin's.
But what I want to say quickly is that the 1990s are the central issue in Russian mind and in American mind. We dislike Putin compared to what we thought we had with Russia in the 1990s. Russians like Putin a lot, 75% positive ratings, because he's created a Russia that is not like the Russia of the 1990s, or at least so they think. And we have two completely different views of that historical narrative, and we've got to get off of that. And my answer is let the Russians have their narrative view, and we can have ours, but let's don't make policy on the basis of it.
We made policy, and your central thrust is that it was the end of the Cold War was American triumphalism.
Set in.
And we took the idea that they were a defeated nation, and in terms of any consideration of the future, they would be a junior partner at best.
Right.
In addition, and someone told me this just today, that he went to a Russian official and said to him, why don't you realize it's in your interest that Iran not have nuclear weapons? And why are you doing this? And the Russian official said, let me ask you this. Why are you doing what you're doing in Georgia? And why are you doing what you're doing in Ukraine, which we consider a threat to our sovereignty?
Yeah. Well, you know where we are. This is called the dialogue of the blind, as we had back in it existed in the 1930s. And the joke was an American goes to Moscow to look at the new subway. It's a beautiful subway. He stands there for 3 hours and no train comes. He turns to his Soviet host and he says, where are the trains? And the guy says, yeah, but what about the way you treat the black people in America? I mean, this is a kind of...
Right.
The answer to that question about Iran, excuse me, that's only a partially valid answer that the Russian gave. I presume it's an American he gave it to. The larger answer is that Russia has 25 million Muslims of its own.
And how many of them, all within Russia?
In the Russian Federation. In Russia.
And how many are in Chechnya?
Still alive?
Yes.
I mean, they've killed everybody, 400,000.
No, that's Putin's policy.
Well, it began with Yeltsin, and it just goes on and on. It's a monstrous war.
It's a central point of Putin, is it not? I'm tough on Chechnya?
It's not wearing as well as it used to, but it was. It brought him to power. But look, to answer your question, they want Iran to have a nuclear weapon even less than we do. They live next door to Iran. And Iran probably can't create a device to deliver a nuclear weapon to New York. It could probably get one to Moscow. But Russia has 25 million Muslims. It can't afford to become part of any Western conflict with Islamic Muslim civilization. It can't and it won't. In fact, its foreign minister, who was the ambassador to the United Nations, and you know him too, Sergei Lavrov, has said repeatedly, Russia's role in the world today is to be an intermediary between Western and Islamic civilization.
That's what he says is the Russian role.
Use us. Don't force us to go into conflict with the Muslim world. We can't. We are part of the Muslim world. 25 million Russians.
But hasn't the administration, or have they not, asked don't they want the Russians to do that? Don't they want the Russians to play a positive role?
In Iran, yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, they've tried.
And in the relationship between Islam and the West.
Well, at least in Iran, that's for sure.
And
they've tried. The Russians were, I mean, the Russian deal is the deal that everybody hopes the Iranians will accept, that the fuel that could be used to make a nuclear weapon will not be processed in Iran, but will go back to Russia. That's the negotiating deal at the moment.
In your judgment, has Putin changed his goals and his strategy and his tactics because he believes the West did not fully understand Russia and did not come to Russia's aid?
Well, I think it's worse than that. I think he thinks that he's been shafted by the United States, badly. But to understand why he feels that way, you have to remember two things. When the first President Bush was president, and Gorbachev agreed to allow a united Germany to go into NATO, that was the sticking point at the end of the Cold War. It was an enormous decision for Soviet Russia to agree that Germany would be in NATO and united. The United States solemnly promised that NATO would never move eastward. And since the 90s, it's moved so much eastward that it now encircles Russia. That's a broken promise. Then the second thing happened, and this was on Putin's watch. He did a lot to help America fight the war in Afghanistan after September 11th, a lot. He put his reputation in Russia on the line. You know, the first phone call to Bush, everybody knows this. There was a second chance for a historic partnership. And as soon as Putin did all that for us, Putin feels, Russians feel, we betrayed him. We pushed NATO further eastward. We withdrew from all these nuclear agreements that we had made with Russia. We demanded unilateral access to Caspian oil. There was no attempt to cooperate with Russia after that. We had abused, as the Russians saw it. Now, where does that leave Putin? On the hot spot. It's his policy. He's pursued essentially a pro-Bush policy. The odd thing is that Bush is now being accused in the United States of being soft on Putin, and Putin's being accused in Moscow of being soft on Bush.
All right. I want to take a look at what Henry Kissinger said on the aforementioned show, if they have this clip. This is talking to Henry Kissinger on this show last week, talking about his meeting about 3 weeks ago with Putin, a private one-on-one meeting. Here it is.
With Russia, I think one of the problems now is to build Russia, to make Russia feel comfortable in the world that is emerging. Of course, they cannot prescribe to us everything that makes them comfortable, but we need to show some understanding for them. Putin wants to be respected and recognized as a major player. And Russia, he wants to restore Russia, which in the image of their population was always a great power, and now it's not. And he wants to restore it to whatever it means to be a great power.
And every Russian probably wants him to.
And most Russians want him to. Paradoxically, he can get that best and maybe only from us if we treat him as an equal, and if we consult him as if he were an equal player. That would mean a great deal to him.
Do you agree with everything he said?
Nearly.
What don't you agree with?
Well, the part that Russia, ordinary Russians pine to be a great power again, I don't think that's their main pining. They just want their lifestyle back that they had
But that's
before.
because it's a more immediate need.
Well, yeah. I mean, they want to take care of their
They would
kids.
rather have food on the table.
No, this is a very smart man. I mean, this is a man who really understands the way great powers work. He knows Russia is a great power. He is a European man. He understands Russia as a European power. He's not speaking as candidly as he might in private because he wants to continue to play this role as a statesman in the United States.
And what would he say if he was speaking more candidly?
Well, he hinted at it on your show. You asked him where it came up, what he thought of Cheney's remarks in Lithuania.
Oh, I did. I asked him. You need to come.
He said he didn't like it. He said it flat out to you. I wouldn't have let him do it, he said.
Yeah, and they say
that
that speech was well vetted in the White House.
They say that. But of course, Secretary of State Rice was on the hot spot there. Was that a counter policy or her policy? And she said she signed. I don't know.
Well, the problem with the statement was that he then left and went and visited a dictatorship.
That was part of it, yeah.
That was the problem.
That was part of it. It was part of the problem.
I mean, are you saying that the United States has no business complaining about human rights, has no business talking about democracy, even if it doesn't want to impose its own kind of democracy or doesn't want to influence its own kind of democracy, that the United States has no business telling Russia what its hopes are for the kind of government it will have? Free market, democratic with a small d, westward looking, etc.
Close to that, I'm saying. Close to that. I mean, there's no great harm in us saying in a general way, gee, we wish you'd be more democratic, and gee, we wish you'd do X, Y, and Z.
Because it's a central policy of this administration's foreign policy.
Well, it was a central part of Clinton's policy, too. It's one thing to kind of say it in a philosophical way. Gee, we wish this would happen. It's another thing to say either you do it or else, and that's the way we've operated.
Is that what we've said?
Well, we have.
What's been the or else then?
Well, the main complaint against Putin in the United States today is that he has, quote, rolled back the democracy that existed in the 1990s.
Is that true or not?
He's continued the process of the rollback of democracy that began in the 1990s. That's the way historians will tell the story.
So there's a rollback of democracy in Russia.
It's been going on, yeah. I mean, the way it worked quickly was Gorbachev established it, Yeltsin, after 3 or 4 years, began to roll it back, and Putin's continued to roll it back. But that is not something that we should be basing policy on. We can limit it. Look, I've been at this 40 years, and I am very unhappy that I will probably die before Russia's a democratic country. I had as big a hopes as anybody. But if I have learned one thing, it's the learned lesson that the late George Kennan taught. Everybody praises Kennan, but nobody pays any attention to what he said.
Famous policy of containment.
No, the other policy, which was there is no point going and lecturing the Russians on what they should or shouldn't do. We aren't wise enough. All we'll do is get their backs up. Let the Russians be Russians. They will sort it out in the end.
Then
that's my policy. Let them sort it out. We got other fish to fry in Russia. We only have one.
But should that be American foreign policy generally? We should not meddle in, have opinions about the foreign policy of other countries. And let's assume that we're talking about Serbia, and let's assume we're talking about Bosnia and Kosovo, and let's assume we're talking about the Middle East, Iran.
Well, those stories, the end of those stories are unwritten, right? Well, about democracy in North Korea and Iran.
No, I'm saying the foreign policy of those countries and the domestic policy. You're saying we have no right in...
But we have to have a priority. What is our #1 interest? In Russia, it's only one thing that really is essential.
Stability.
Yes, and that more generally, Russia's weapons of mass destruction, and secondarily, its vast energy resources, not be used or turned against the West. That is the #1 priority.
But that's exactly what the administration says they're doing, turning their energy resources against the West by using it as a leverage.
That's right. And I'm here to tell you that we drove them in that direction. That's where the argument begins. That's my argument. That need not... In the current issue of a journal I know you read, Foreign Affairs, from the Council on Foreign Relations, there is an article by a very pro-American Russian called Russia Leaves the Western Orbit.
Right.
He thinks we've lost it. It's over. They're gone. They've gone to China. They've gone to Iran. They may go to Iraq, Afghanistan, but they're gone. I don't agree. I think they're halfway out the door, but there's a struggle in Moscow over that direction. Should they go all the way and give up on the West, or should they stay? But I do believe we've driven them in that direction since 1990.
You actually suggest in this article that organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, which sponsored a study by the CFR, and headed by Kemp and Edwards, was part of the problem, not the solution.
Oh boy, is it, It's really an unbalanced, biased, unwise document. It's called, think what it's called, this is fantastic, Russia's Wrong Direction. Do we have the right or the wisdom to say of a country bigger and older than us, you're going in the wrong direction? How would we feel if Russia turned to us and said, under Bush, you're going in the wrong direction?
So what ought to be done now? Here, before you answer that, is what Nick Burns, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, said to me in March of this year.
We need to be realistic about Russia. On the one hand, if you want to have a world that's peaceful in terms of maintenance of nuclear stability, you've got to have a relationship with Russia. If you want to be effective counterterrorism on a global basis, well, Russia's on our side on that issue. There'll be times when we can work very well with President Putin and his government. There'll be other times, and I think you've seen a number of them over the last year or two, where we're going to have to say we disagree, and we're not able to work with them.
Boy, that seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, it does, except that he's not telling the whole story. In December, Nicholas Burns, announced on behalf of the State Department that our great mission for 2006, 7, and 8 is to move NATO military bases even more around Russia and to take in Ukraine and Georgia. All the good things he said about how we have to work with Russia are going right down the toilet.
To include Georgia and Ukraine in NATO.
Especially Ukraine. In NATO. In NATO. Yeah, well, it's already announced policy.
Yeah.
And that's the end of the road right there. If we do that, it's over.
Yeah, but I'm not disagreeing with you, but I am suggesting this, that people said that if the United States favored the expansion of NATO, it would be over.
Maybe some people said it, I don't know. But Russia was weak, and it was under Yeltsin, and Yeltsin made concessions, and as Russians like to say...
Well, Putin had an opportunity there, too. I mean, we can't just go back and say everything has to do with Yeltsin, not with Putin. Putin did
But he has drawn the line now, Putin has. He's drawn the line
with Ukraine?
With Ukraine, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
you know what happened in Ukraine 2 weeks ago when American troops showed up in Crimea, which is a Russian province of Ukraine, and local Russian protesters in Ukraine, in Crimea, drove the American warship and 200 Marines out. That's a foreboding of what's going to happen if we put troops in Ukraine.
What should the United States do?
Back off. Back off. We can't kick the countries that we've taken into NATO out, but we don't have to put military bases
Okay.
there.
What else other than expansion of NATO?
Say to Russia, we recognize that you're a sovereign, autonomous country. Run your own internal affairs within reason as you see fit. We would like for you to become democrats, but be as civil as you can. It's your business. It's your destiny. Abroad, you have legitimate national interests, particularly in what the Russians call their near abroad, the former Soviet republics. We will not intervene in those areas as long as you behave decently toward those people. That's our policy. Then the ball's in the Russian corner. Behave decently. What does decently mean? Don't occupy them. Don't bully them. But when Russia says to Ukraine, gas will now cost you not whatever they were charging them, $50 a unit, but 95, while the Russians are selling to the Europeans for 250, and we say you're bullying Ukraine, come on. Russia's subsidizing Ukraine at the moment, $3.5 billion a year on cheap gas, and we're saying keep doing that while we take Ukraine to our side. I mean, this is not serious. Putin's made this point a dozen times. What are you asking us to do?
Yeah. I should say to the audience that you, not only a Russian scholar, you spend a couple of months every year there in Moscow, and you talk to lots of people, not just government leaders and scholars, but also you get around and try to understand what's going on in this country. I assume it's your second favorite country after the United States.
Second, yes.
That's
second.
Fair enough.
Second. Because I haven't been many other places, so
Yeah,
I don't know.
But this has been your life's work.
40 years, yeah, 40 years.
And at the end of the day, when you say this relationship is bad and it's mostly America's fault.
Since 1991. It's not about the Cold War, the past Cold War, but since 91, it's not mostly, it is primarily the unwise policies of the United States under 2 administrations. I feel there's a last hurrah for me, the next presidential election. And the worst part of the story is I don't see a single presidential candidate interested in this issue. They're either accusing Bush of being soft, or they're not interested, or they're silent. But of course, they like to be silent about everything. They don't want to talk about anything if they possibly can. But this is the most serious foreign policy issue, if not today, for my kids and grandkids. And it is getting worse by the day, and I don't see the way out unless we can find a leader who understands that this is got to be changed.
This is The Nation magazine, The New American Cold War by Stephen F. Cohen.